In order for the Western world to truly prosper, the crisis and decadence should broaden and increase in strength. And from how it looks, this is what is going to happen. It would certainly affect people's lifestyle, but then again, the broadening of the crisis has been happening consistently in the last 400 years, and we seem to be fine, at least yet. Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. In this video, I wish to talk about the end of the world and, as a more special case thereof, the collapse of the Western civilization. So, in 1918 to 1922, Oswald Spengler, the German thinker, has published his, one of the most influential books, arguably, of the 20th century, named The Decline of the West, Der Untergang des Abendlandes, okay? And there he claims, among other things, that the Western civilization is coming to an end soon. So he derived a rough time of the existence of civilization based on the accepted textbook timeline, right? And that, in his estimate, is roughly 1500 years, and therefore he concludes that the Western civilization is going to run out of steam, so to speak, and is going to end as well. Okay? And I wish to challenge this idea in two ways, at least, in literal way, in a literal sense, let's say, and in a fundamental way, more importantly, as a philosopher, as usual. So my literal challenge to this idea of his is that, except for, speaking about the timelines and the cycles and things like that, which I would also challenge, but this is not the point of this video. So my literal challenge to Spengler's thinking is that, you see, just as with the end of the world in general, many people were saying the same thing both before him and after him, okay? Actually long before him. So you may have heard the term, the French word décadence, which means decadence or decay, decline, etc. And it's mostly used specifically towards the decline of moral values in society, the decline of society itself, the inability of the social structures to reproduce themselves, etc., etc., when everything falls apart, essentially, right? And the word actually originates in medieval Latin, decadentia, right? And it has appeared, actually, if it's medieval Latin, aka ecclesiastical Latin, it should be read decadentia, right? Not tia on a Roman imperial manner. But anyway, it appeared in 16th century, in French, right? Of course, there wasn't a French language in 16th century. It was a Paris dialect, essentially, and the very early form thereof. But anyway, so the word has been used since then. So at least since then, people have been talking about this stuff. So for, roughly speaking, 450 years maybe, or even more than that. So yeah. So there have been pretty much always people concerned with the state of the society, especially the state of the youth, or the youth is decadent, their moral values are questionable, etc., etc. People have been, especially old people have been talking about this pretty much since the dawn of time, alright? Even in ancient times, in well-recorded history, Aristotle was talking about this, the half-mythical poet Hesiod was talking about this, Horace in Rome, the famous poet, was talking, arguably the best poet in Roman literature, was talking about this, etc., etc. Then even in more recent times, in, let's say, 1624, there was a guy named Thomas Barnes who has written a book called The Wise Man's Forecast Against the Evil Time, which is sort of speaking of itself, the title, right? So it gives us a rather grim look at the morals and youth specifically of the time. So the guy basically says, the society is gonna collapse, guys. It's the clown world. It's the Joker time, etc., etc. But as you can see, 400 years later, we're still kind of okay. You can't even tell that the life today is worse than it has been 400 years before. In fact, I would argue it's much, much better, orders of magnitude better. But yeah, there you go. There are your literal examples. Of course, there have been also church thinkers condemning the morality of the people of their time, etc., etc., pretty much always. And after Spengler, there have always, like, not always, there have been thinkers who have been repeating the same, more or less, thought pattern. Like, for example, there was a Russian thinker, Lev Gumilov. I'm gonna link, like, his bio from Wiki or somewhere else in the description so you can read it for yourself. But he had a theory of ethnos, you know, like how ethnic groups evolve over time. And he had a very similar idea, like ethnogenesis, he called it. So the idea was that, yeah, ethnos has the certain resource, which he called passionarity. And apparently, like, there is a limited amount of this passionarity in every given ethnos, and it's sort of being spent over time. So at some point, the ethnos runs out of steam, so to speak, and dies out. And again, just as Spengler says that civilizations run out of steam at some point and die out, so did Gumilov when he was talking about the ethnic groups specifically. So yeah, basically my literal challenge to Spengler's idea is that there have been basically the same ideas since the dawn of time. And yeah, we're still here and everything is still kind of fine. And in fact, the best in recorded history, I would argue, okay? But that was just like a superficial, literal challenge, which is actually applicable to any end of the world type of claims, right? There have been infinite number of predictions of the end of the world, and yet we're still here, all right? Even though, as you know, the world has actually ended on December 21st, 2012, but the government has covered it up, all right? So now I wish to propose you a more serious fundamental challenge to Spengler's idea of the collapse of the West, and that is, I'm actually gonna give you an analogy first. So I've read a really interesting idea like a couple of weeks ago that the point of the British Empire is in being in the constant state of decline or decay or collapse or disintegration, or whichever you prefer. So obviously, I mean, the examples are, again, they are pretty obvious. It's the transformation of the empire itself into the Commonwealth, you know, with the supposedly independent states. We know how much independence they have. The colonies, I mean, like India, like China, Australia, Canada, etc., etc. Of course, there have been this proverbial closure of the naval bases east of Suez, the Suez Canal, and Wiki actually has a whole article literally called East of Suez. So there have been a lot of ruckus about this in 1960s and 70s, let's say. This has also been used as the point of, like, firstly, the independence of India was considered the collapse of the British Empire, then the retreat from the east of the Suez in the 70s was considered the collapse of the British Empire. Like, it just keeps moving forwards in time, you know, and it just doesn't seem to be able to completely collapse at any point in time, right? So yeah, like, okay, I could have added like Soviet Union collapse as another step of the same process because, as you know, wink wink, Soviet Union was a British colony and so was Russia until very recently, and to a degree it still is. But yeah, that would be a bit too conspiratorial. Then the handover of the Hong Kong, which again established a full control of Britain over China, which is usually like perceived as a completely reverse process, which is funny again, but whatever. So the point is, the point of the British Empire is in being in a constant state of decay or collapse, right? And by analogy, and this is kind of the main point of this video, we might say that the point of the Western civilization as it is in being in the constant crisis, okay? So, if you think about it, the main point of the European civilization, or European/Western civilization, if we include the Americas here, is progress, alright? Which means, like, positive development, right? But what is perceived by some as progress, i.e., again, positive development may be perceived and is actually perceived as regress by other people. By regress, I mean negative development, all right? So there have always been like the two sides of this coin, if you wish, of the Western world. There is a party of progress, there is a party of conservatism. There are people who consider any new changes which disrupt the previous order of things as good, and there is a party of people who perceived it as bad, right? There is always a Renaissance / Enlightenment / feminism Marxism party, and there is always like a conservative, traditionalist, Christian, fundamentalist type of party, right? So there is an attack and defense, if you wish. And again, it is mirrored in the political systems, even, as we've discussed in my previous videos on democracy and totalitarianism, for example. I'm going to link it in the description. So the two-party system where one party attacks, i.e. promotes this new disruptive, crisis-oriented agenda, and a second party which defends, which tries to keep the previous order of things intact, keep the status quo. So one embraces the crises and tries to intensify them, and the other is trying to stop them and, roughly speaking, fix things, return to the previous state. But the net result is that there is a slow drift of the increase in crises. So more, bigger and bigger disruption of the previous order of things over time, right? So, as much as you defend, there is always like an attacker is always slightly ahead of you, right? And what does it mean is that the net result is that the crisis broadens. It's just not as fast as it would have been otherwise if there was only the attacking party. And thus, as the crisis broadens, the West increases its strength. All right? It may be helpful to consider the American take on this issue. So the Americas and the United States, as they're like the pinnacle of their power, are the West of the West, if you wish. And they're more concerned with the end of the world and the end of the civilization as a proxy, civilization collapse, than anyone else. And hence, for example, well, I've given many examples. Actually, I've talked about this in some of my previous videos where I talked about why, for example, Velikovsky became so popular in America, specifically in the United States. Well, it's because they are always concerned with the end of the world, with the apocalypse, with the crushing of the government, and bella omnes contra omnes, whatever it's called, the war of everyone against everyone, right? The Thomas Hobbes expression. Bella omnium contra omnes, I think it's called. Okay. And what else? Yeah, and Velikovsky was talking about the catastrophes, right? The huge crises, like the literally planetary-wide upheavals, etc., etc. That's why he gained so much popularity. Again, specifically in the United States, not much so in Europe and other places of the world. Well, why is that? Well, because Americans lack this thick layer of culture beneath them. Again, comparing them to Europe here. So Europeans know they have like at least a couple of thousand years of well-recorded history, perhaps more. But then again, it's a subject of debate. But at least, while Americans actually arrived at their continent, I mean, not counting the natives, but the European Americans, if you wish, Western Americans, have arrived at their continent already during the well-recorded history, okay? So that gives them much more self-awareness in this sense, and it's actually driving this dread, this ontological dread of Americanism, which is again the end of the world. Like, we are built like on nothing, essentially, like everything might collapse literally tomorrow, etc., etc. And thus you have these specifically American cultural tendencies like preppers, who again literally prepare for the end of the world on an individual level, right? They're gathering ammo and canned food and stuff. Again, being driven by this American myth of self-reliance, again, which also feeds off into their idea of how they gained independence. which is completely untrue. I mean, again, the largest land battle of the American War of Independence was the Siege of Gibraltar in Spain. So basically, it was the war of the world against Britain, essentially. It wasn't the American War of, American War of Independence, right? That gained them independence, essentially. And again, why am I saying that it's a myth of self-reliance? Well, even today, if you look at the United States, they're a country with literally the biggest budget in the world, like by far. The second place is China, and they have like twice smaller budget than the United States. So the United States is like almost the most socialistic country, actually not almost, the most socialistic country in the world, at least in terms of scale. Okay? So yeah, no self-reliance here, unfortunately. So yeah, again, interest in various like post-nuclear, post-apocalyptic worlds is also a purely American invention. Of course, it later like creeped into other nations like Europe, specifically Japan and many other places, but by proxy. Things like Fallout, Mad Max, those kinds of things, I mean. All right. Yeah, so, but we'll return to this in the PS to this video, to the American take, okay? But it's interesting to consider, right? And you can see how America is like the best manifestation of the Western civilization, and exactly for this reason, because they are obsessed with the end of the world, and this is with a crisis, you know, with instability, etc., etc. And this is the essence of the Western civilization in the first place, okay? So yeah, okay, so Spengler also predicted that roughly in the year 2000, the totalitarian the totalitarian era would start, okay? Which means, roughly speaking, you know, Roman Empire, following Roman Republic, let's say, which would last for a couple of centuries, and then, after that, the Western civilization would finally cease to exist. So that this is Spengler's idea. And here I actually agree with him, in the sense of the coming totalitarian era. And I talked about this again in my recent videos. I'm going to link them in the description, about the totalitarian character of democracy. The first video, and the second video is obsession with safety, all right? However, as you can see from these videos, the basis of my prediction about the totalitarian era is completely different. It's based on the nature of gender and the dynamics of power in society. Plus, I heavily disagree, as I've noted in the beginning, with the timelines that Spengler was using, the Jesuit version of history, from which he derived his 1500-year cycles, which I think is incorrect in the first place, the version of history that is. Therefore, I don't actually predict the collapse of the Western world. In fact, more likely, I would predict the strengthening of the Western world. Because, again, the point of this video is that in order for the Western world to truly prosper, the crisis and decadence should broaden and increase in strength. And from how it looks, this is what is going to happen. It would certainly affect people's lifestyle. But then again, the broadening of the crisis has been happening consistently in the last 400 years, and we seem to be fine, at least yet. And I wish to finish this video on a more esoteric point. So, returning to Spengler, the title of his book, Der Untergang des Abendlandes, if you translate it literally, word by word, it means the sunset of the evening land, which is sort of a game of words, if you might notice, right? Because West is where the sun sets. It's the land of the evening. It's the end and collapse and death, essentially, right? It's the evening land. So the sunset of the evening land, in some esoteric sense, again, might be perceived as a rise of Europe or rise of the West rather than the decline of the West. Because when it's an evening land and it like receives a sunset, it's at its domain. It's like exactly what it's supposed to have, right? So there you go. West is where all day days will someday end. You know, this Van der Graaf generator song. Maybe I'll link it in the description as well. So basically, where there is the evening, the end and collapse and death, the West actually prospers. And what is the most influential region in the world recently? It's California, right? And it's the end of the world in the literal geographical sense of the word. And it's at the forefront of the end of the world temporally, you might say. It's like at the very edge of the ending of the world. It's the very essence of the West, therefore. And it's not going away anytime soon. So I think that the most misunderstood point about the end of the world is that it's not something that is going to happen, but rather it's something that simply is. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing.